The desert before sunrise holds a kind of silence no empire can own. The horizon glows faintly, and the dunes seem carved not by wind, but by memory. In that fragile light, the world is ancient again, as it was when a man once walked here in solitude, between revelation and remembrance. His name would one day echo across centuries, yet in these years no chronicler followed him. Only the wind, the sand, and the stars bore witness. Historians mark these as the years of retreat, the period between the first vision within the cave of Hira and the later call to proclaim. Archaeological surveys around Jabal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light, still find traces of early dwellings carved into its slopes, dark alcoves once used by hermits seeking divine silence. Inside, soot from ancient fires clings to the rock, a blackened breath from generations who came seeking answers beyond words. It was here, in a cave now called Hira, that he returned again and again, seeking the voice that once shook him into awe. But for a long span there was only quiet. No command, no verse, only the sound of his own breath echoing against the stone. Biographers later called it the pause of revelation, a season that tested faith through stillness. Yet in that stillness, something invisible was being written. His nights stretched beneath constellations that the Bedouins read as maps of destiny. Orion's belt, the Pleiades, the long river of the Milky Way, all mirrored the long, unseen current of his thought. Down in the valley, life continued untouched. The Quraysh bartered spices and silk. Caravans from Yemen passed under the same stars. No one knew that history's next dawn was already stirring in the silence above them. He would descend sometimes, walk through the markets, greet familiar faces, then vanish again toward the mountain before dusk. Those who remembered him said he looked both near and distant, like someone listening to something no one else could hear. Archaeological notes from early explorers of the Hijaz describe pathways worn into the rock by generations of seekers. On some stones, faint inscriptions in Old South Arabian script remain, perhaps marks of prayers, perhaps simply directions for water. But among them, one carving stands apart, a crescent and a dot beneath it, the oldest symbol of guidance in the desert. Even the rock seemed to remember that a revelation, once paused, would soon return. In those unrecorded years, solitude became the teacher. The rhythm of the wind replaced discourse. The desert itself became a scripture of patience. He prayed not with words but with silence, not to be seen but to be emptied. Every grain of sand shimmered like an unwritten verse, waiting for the breath that would one day give it meaning. When at last the voice returned, not as thunder but as mercy, it found him prepared. The silence had carved its own temple inside him. What had seemed like absence was a slow formation, the unseen work of faith deepening its roots. Scholars often say revelation began with sound, but perhaps it truly began with listening. The dunes shift, the centuries pass, and the mountain still stands. Pilgrims now climb its steep path, their footsteps echoing faintly where he once walked. In the cave, the air is cool and motionless. Dust drifts through a narrow beam of light, and for a moment, it feels as though time itself is breathing. Perhaps the silence between two revelations was never an absence, but a bridge, a space where the eternal prepared itself to speak again. Perhaps that stillness was the true message, the one not written in words but in waiting. Some voices only echo when the heart is ready to listen. The wind moves through the corridors of old Medina like a sigh that never ends. Night gathers along the edges of forgotten manuscripts, and every lamp that burns seems to remember an older flame. Among the scrolls that survived the birth of an empire, and those that did not, there is one that history speaks of only in whispers. A fragment of parchment said to have glowed with words of mercy so radiant that they could not endure the hands of kings. It is not in any museum, nor in any scholar's catalog, but in the quiet archives of early Islam, its shadow remains. A page that vanished not from neglect, but from fire. When the prophet journeyed north in his youth, leading caravans through the desert's spine, Tema was already old, a city built by empires and forgotten by them. It was said to be rich in wells and pomegranate groves, surrounded by date palms that shimmered like glass at noon. Its people traded in salt and silk, Its scribes carved prayers to deities long since buried. Yet beneath the noise of barter, there lingered a kind of waiting, the still breath of a city that had once known faith and lost it. He arrived near twilight. The travelers who later told the story, their words preserved only in the soft margin notes of early hadith collectors, said he dismounted quietly, asked for water, and stood for a long while watching the sun fall behind the city's western wall. The people did not know him then. They saw only another merchant from the south, a man with kind eyes and a manner of silence too deep for trade. He stayed a night or two, perhaps 3. No miracles, no sermons, only stillness. He prayed at dawn beside the city's well, facing no direction anyone could name. A shepherd later swore he saw him writing something in the dust with a twig, then wiping it away before standing to leave. When he departed, no one followed. Tama's gates closed behind him, and the city returned to its routine, measuring grain, loading camels, arguing over price. But something changed. In the years that followed, the city began to fade. Its wells sank deeper. The traders moved north toward Damascus. The roads that once echoed with caravan bells fell silent. By the time early Muslim geographers recorded it, Tama had already become a ruin of echoing stone. A place where once the stars were close, wrote Al-Hamadani. But now the wind keeps count of prayers no one remembers. Centuries later, when explorers from Europe came searching for the lost oases of the Hijaz, they found Tama buried beneath dunes, its wells dry, its arches open to the sky. In one corner of a crumbling wall, they discovered a single carving, faint, almost erased. A man in flowing robes, walking with his head bowed. The inscription beside him, barely legible, read, "The stranger who walked without sound." The stone now rests in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, labeled simply, Nabatean relief, 6th century CE. Was it him? The scholars shrug. Perhaps the figure is myth or the product of later devotion. But the feeling remains, that a presence once passed through this place too quietly to leave a monument, and yet too deeply to vanish. In mystical writings, Tama came to symbolize the heart that forgets, a place that received truth for a moment, then turned away. The Sufi poet Al-Hallaj wrote, "There are cities in us that once heard God, and then slept." He may have meant this ruin, or the ruins within all who listen and then turn back to noise. Today, if you visit the site, a vast plain of broken stone, a few palm trunks blackened by time, the air itself feels suspended. Tourists rarely come. Bedouins pass by sometimes, their camels pausing at the shallow wells that still hold a shimmer of water. When the wind moves, it carries the scent of salt and something else. Perhaps pomegranate, perhaps memory. From the nearby plateau, the desert stretches in endless amber waves. The road the prophet once traveled now lies beneath asphalt and engines, yet the same horizon holds. Some nights, when the moon rises low, the ruins seem to flicker, as if light were tracing an old path through stone. The archaeologists call it reflection. The faithful call it return. The city that forgot his footsteps never truly forgot. Sleeps, half dreaming, half listening. Beneath the sand, the wells still murmur faintly, and in that murmur is the echo of a prayer once whispered before dawn. A prayer not recorded, not repeated, but remembered by the earth itself. When the libraries of the first centuries were built, in Damascus, Basra, and later Baghdad, scribes worked by candlelight to preserve every revelation, every letter that might have once touched the prophet's presence. Yet many of those early collections were lost. In 1258, when the Mongols entered Baghdad, the great Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, fell into flame. Chroniclers wrote that the Tigris ran black for 7 days, ink from countless scrolls bleeding into the river. Among those uncounted texts was rumored to be one manuscript known only as the Book of Compassion, written not by command, but by reflection, a collection of sayings spoken in private moments, never recited to the public. Perhaps that is the way of revelation. It leaves traces not in books, but in silence. It moves through cities, through hearts, through centuries, until even the dust begins to remember the sound of grace passing by. The night deepens, the wind rises. Across the dunes, the stars emerge. the same stars he saw when he looked back once before leaving. They shine faintly on the ruins, on the old stones, on the forgotten gate. And though no one walks there now, the sand still holds the rhythm of those vanished steps. Perhaps some cities are meant to fade, so that what passed through them might never die. Night descends like a veil woven from eternity. Above the sleeping desert, the sky unfolds in stillness, a vast, breathing cathedral of stars. Somewhere beyond the dunes, beneath that infinite silence, he dreams. The air is cool, the sand glows faintly under moonlight, and in that delicate hour between wakefulness and surrender, the unseen world opens like a gate. In the dream, the moon is closer than it should be. It hovers low, luminous and trembling, as though listening. Around it, the constellations sway gently: Orion, the hunter; Canopus, the navigator; and the faint dust of the Milky Way, arcing like a forgotten script across heaven's dome. The dream feels heavier than sleep, lighter than thought. He does not walk, yet he moves. He does not speak, yet the silence around him understands. Long before revelation descended as sound, it came as vision, a language of light. Early records preserved by Ibn Hisham and later by al-Bukhari mention the true dreams that came to the prophet in his early years of solitude. Dreams that unfolded at dawn and were as clear as the breaking of day. Scholars of later centuries, such as Ibn Arabi, saw these dreams as the training ground of prophecy, the place where heaven rehearses its voice in the heart of the listener. And so, in one such dream, perhaps this one, the moon bowed, not as a celestial body but as something sentient, a symbol older than human speech. Its light softened, almost human in its sorrow. Centuries later, when explorers sifted through the ruins near Al-Karawiyyan in Morocco, they found faint traces of pages written in early Kufic script, elegant, deliberate, unadorned. One bore the faint impression of a word repeated in soft rhythm: Rama, mercy. No verse number followed it, no title, as if the writer had begun something not meant to be finished. In the stillness, he understood not with his mind, but with something deeper, that all of creation was a conversation, and the moon was its patient listener. The stars were witnesses, the wind the scribe. It was not a message to proclaim, but to carry within. Historians have long noted how the moon became woven through the imagery of Islam, on coins, minarets, flags, and calendars. Yet its earliest sacred meaning was not of rule or measure, but of listening. The Quranic verses revealed later would echo that celestial intimacy. And the moon, we have measured for it phases until it returns like an old curved palm branch. The early believers, hearing those words, must have felt the echo of an older truth, that light itself bends in obedience. In the dream, the desert around him shifts. The dunes ripple like waves under unseen wind. The horizon dissolves into brightness, and through it he sees, not with eyes, but through presence, the long corridors of time. The prophets before him, their voices carried by different tongues, yet bound by the same silence before dawn. Abraham beneath his stars, Moses beneath his fire, Jesus beneath his olive trees. All looked upward, and the same moon looked back. This was not a dream of prophecy, but of lineage, the sacred thread of seekers who gazed at the same sky and heard the same silence between divine breaths. In that recognition, he feels something both vast and gentle. The dream teaches him that revelation is not conquest, but continuation. The same light returning to remind the world it never truly left. Modern astronomers studying pre-Islamic Arabian skies confirm that the full moon of Shaban in the early 7th century would have risen low and large over the Hijaz horizon, its path crossing the constellation Virgo, a rare alignment. Whether coincidence or providence, the scene described in early biographies mirrors this exact vision. A moon descending toward the desert as if stooping to speak. Science records the orbit. Faith remembers the meaning. When he wakes, the world feels changed. The stars are still the same, yet their silence carries weight. The moon, pale and distant now, feels less like an object, more like a companion. He rises, brushes the sand from his robe, and looks toward the horizon where dawn trembles like a secret about to be spoken. The dream lingers not as image, but as presence. In later years, when revelation began to descend with the thunder of certainty, he would recall that dream. The moon, listening. The silence, answering. During the famous event of the splitting of the moon, Shak al-Qamar, recorded by early chroniclers and mentioned in the Quran itself, those who stood near him would see the celestial orb divide like a page turned by unseen hands. Whether miracle or metaphor, it echoed that first dream's message, that the universe itself listens when truth is spoken softly enough. Mystics across centuries have pondered that image. The moon halved, yet whole, broken yet radiant. To them, it was not a cosmic spectacle but a mirror of the soul. The human heart, they said, is a moon it must break to reflect. Ibn al-Farid, the great Sufi poet, wrote, "My heart was split, and therein the moon of meaning shone." Perhaps that was what the dream taught, that illumination begins with surrender, and that even light must learn to bow. Modern travelers who climb Jabal al-Nur on nights of full moon still speak of a strange quietness near the summit, as though the mountain absorbs sound. Cameras fail to capture the glow that spreads across its stones. Scientists attribute it to light refraction and volcanic minerals, but the pilgrims call it remembrance, the mountain remembering the night it learned to listen to. Historians have debated whether such a scroll ever truly existed. But among Sufi masters of the 10th and 11th centuries, the story endured. They told of a parchment that burned without ash, a script that turned to light. The mystic Abu Hamid al-Ghazali once wrote that divine truth, when too pure, withdraws itself before human eyes, like a flame that consumes its own wick. Perhaps the lost scroll was one such truth, too luminous to remain in the material world. Somewhere between myth and memory, the dream endures. The moon still rises over the same desert, tracing the same arc across the same stars. The dunes shift, the empires crumble, but that light remains, soft, forgiving, eternal. The listener may change, but the message never does. And perhaps, when the world grows too loud, it will return again, that ancient dream that taught even the moon how to listen. Because revelation does not end with words. It continues in the way silence shapes us. It speaks in every pause, every breath, every shimmer of light that waits patiently on the water before fading into dawn. There are rivers that exist only in memory, and there are memories that flow like rivers. Between the red plains of the Hijaz and the shadowed hills of ancient Taif, a narrow valley once carried such a stream, quiet, winding, silver under moonlight. It was called Wadi al-Akik, the Blessed Valley, though its name, like most blessings, faded from the maps. In that valley, beneath the slow pulse of stars, the prophet once stood and watched the water shimmer through stone. It was said that he called it a sacred valley beloved to God. Centuries later, travelers would write of its beauty. The 10th century geographer Al-Muqaddasi described the Akik as a valley where the heart becomes patient, its banks lined with acacia and tamarisk, its pools reflecting stars like coins of glass. Even today, when rains are kind and the desert breathes again, the old course of that river reappears, not as flood, but as remembrance. It snakes through the cracked earth, a faint gleam of persistence, like a thought the world cannot erase. In the days before Medina knew revelation, he would often walk there alone. The desert behind him, the city still ahead, the river in between. It was neither destination nor crossing, only a pause, a place to listen to the language of water. When the prophet's sandals touched its banks, the valley must have seemed timeless, the murmur of water folding over stones, reeds bending with wind, a heron lifting into dusk. The world was soundless except for the breathing of creation itself. Historians of the early Islamic period wrote that the prophet loved places where life met silence. Wells, oases, rivers after rain. They were mirrors of mercy. Small, fragile proofs that the divine still flowed through the ordinary. The Akik, he once said, was blessed not because it gave water, but because it remembered what water meant: renewal, cleansing, forgiveness. Still, clues remain like drifting embers. In the library of Sana'a, Yemen, fragments of Quranic manuscripts were discovered hidden within the walls of the Great Mosque, parchments that predate most known copies by decades. German conservators who studied them in the 1970s noted an unusual layering. Verses written, then erased, then rewritten. The scholars saw it as revision. The mystics saw it as revelation teaching itself restraint. Between one word and another, they said, the divine pauses to breathe. Archaeologists working near Medina have uncovered ancient irrigation channels carved from limestone, older than Islam by centuries. They found ceramic jars, some marked with Nabatean symbols for life and purity, buried near the old streambeds. When they filled one with fresh rainwater, the scent that rose was sweet, almost like dates. It is as though the stone remembers. One archaeologist wrote in her notes. Perhaps she was right, for the desert has always been a keeper of memory, and rivers, when they vanish, do not die. They retreat into time, waiting for the heart to rediscover them. When the prophet later made Medina his home, he would recall that valley. The Quran itself holds the echo of it. And we made from water every living thing. To those who heard that verse, it was revelation. To him, it must have been remembrance. The whisper of that patient river winding through his solitude, murmuring truths too simple for language. There are reports that on the night of migration, Hijra, when he left Mecca for Medina, he passed again near the river's course. Some companions said he paused and smiled, pointing toward its glimmer under the moonlight. Others said he dipped his fingers into the water and let it fall back slowly, drop by drop. No one knows what he thought in that moment. Perhaps he was bidding farewell to silence. Perhaps he knew that the next time he returned, he would not walk as a seeker, but as a messenger. The valley still lies there today, carved between ancient basalt ridges. Modern pilgrims traveling from Mecca to Medina can glimpse its path beside the highway, dry most of the year, but shining after storm. Locals say that when rain falls at night, the water carries a soft red hue, as if stained by memory. They call it the river that refuses to forget. Children collect its pebbles, smooth and pink, believing they bring good dreams. And sometimes, when the air is still, the surface of a pool trembles without wind, as though something unseen moves beneath. Mystics through the centuries have written about this river. To them, it became a symbol of the soul, always flowing, even when hidden. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya wrote, "The believer's heart is like the valley of a kick, sometimes dry, yet never empty, for mercy sleeps beneath its stones." In Persian poetry, it appears as the stream that dreams of its own sound. For the Sufis, it was proof that memory itself is sacred, that to remember the divine is to let one's life flow in the same direction as mercy. During the Ottoman era, when engineers rebuilt old wells near Medina, they followed what they believed was the Prophet's path along the Akik. In the archives of Topkapi Palace survives a letter from a 16th century architect named Sinan al-Hijazi, who wrote, "We traced the watercourse said to have touched the messenger's shadow, and though it is gone to dust, the ground itself trembles with peace. Perhaps that trembling still remains. The valley at night glows faintly under the moon, not bright, but aware. The stones gleam like old coins. The air hums with a warmth that has no source. Travelers who rest there often speak of dreams, gentle, wordless visions of light moving through water, of voices reciting verses they cannot recall upon waking." Scientists, of course, dismiss this as suggestion. The brain's echo in the stillness of desert night. But faith has always lived in echoes. When dawn comes, the river disappears again, slipping back into its bed of dust. Only the scent of wet stone remains. Yet somehow, the valley feels alive, as if something unseen continues to move beneath the surface. Perhaps remembrance itself flows there, invisible but endless. Maybe that is what he saw that day long ago. Not water, but the reflection of eternity learning to move through the finite. The river was not meant to be crossed, but to be understood. That nothing sacred is ever truly lost. As the last light fades, the valley hums with its ancient breath. The sky turns to pearl, and the moon rises once more, pale, faithful, listening. The water glimmers briefly, then fades. But deep within the earth, it keeps flowing unseen, unending. The fire that destroyed the unknown scroll may not have been only of earthly origin. Some accounts from early Medina speak of a night when a luminous light was seen descending near the prophet's quarters. A glow that lingered, then vanished, leaving behind the scent of parchment and musk. To the faithful, it was a sign that heaven takes back what it lends. To the skeptics, merely a tale woven from longing. Yet every faith is born between those two winds, the yearning to remember, and the fear of what might have been forgotten. Because the divine never forgets the path it once took to reach us. And the river, like the heart, remembers everything. The horizon was a boundary that never stayed still. It trembled like a mirage at noon, glowed like a secret at dusk, and vanished each night beneath the folds of the stars. For those who crossed deserts, the horizon was promise and peril, a line between what was known and what was waiting. For the prophet, it became something else, a gate, not of stone or gold, but of light unseen yet certain, the place where the visible world bent toward eternity. By the time he neared the final years of his journey, the silence that had once filled caves and gardens began to change. It no longer waited, it beckoned. The revelations had flowed like rivers, verse after verse, like breath after storm, and yet there remained a stillness that the words could not hold. History would later call these his last days, but the mystics say otherwise. They say they were his first steps into timelessness. It was the 10th year after the migration to Medina. The city had grown, a living scripture of light and humanity. The marketplace hummed with voices from across Arabia. Palm groves thickened, wells deepened, and the Masjid al-Nabawi, his mosque, had become the heart of the world. And yet, even in the midst of companionship, he often withdrew at night. Those close to him noticed the change, the deepening quiet in his gaze, the pauses before speech. He would sit outside the city, on the gentle rise beyond Kuba, watching the desert melt into dusk. One evening, the companions saw him tracing lines in the sand again. "This," he whispered, "is the horizon of truth, the veil between now and forever." His finger moved across the earth, marking the curve of distance as though sketching something unseen. No one understood then. It would be years before they realized that even the prophet was looking beyond revelation, toward the gate from which revelation itself had come. Historians record that the prophet's final pilgrimage took place under skies of remarkable clarity. From Arafat, he gazed across the sea of pilgrims, the wind tugging softly at his cloak. The sermon he delivered that day was brief, tender, and complete. A farewell not of endings, but of release. "Today," he said, "I have perfected for you your faith." It was as though heaven had closed the circle. But those who stood near him swore that, for a fleeting moment, he looked past them, toward the horizon, as if someone unseen was calling from beyond the light. Later chronicles note that, upon returning to Medina, he often sat by a small grove at the edge of the Akik Valley, his hands folded in stillness. There are reports preserved in the Sunan of al-Nasa'i describing how he would raise his eyes to the sunset and remain unmoving long after prayer. The scholars debated the reason. The mystics did not. To them, it was the gaze of a man already seeing through two worlds at once, one fading, one arriving. In that final season, Medina was hushed. The wind grew gentle. Even the palms seemed to bend more slowly. The prophet's home was modest, a clay room adjoining the mosque. Yet within those walls, time itself softened. His words became fewer, lighter, distilled like dew. When asked how he felt, he replied only, "The companion above has called me." In one surviving record from the 9th century, the historian Ibn Sa'd mentions, "Letters gathered but hidden, for their tenderness was not fit for kings." He does not explain. Perhaps he could not. Some believe those writings contained reflections not on law or command, but on silence, on how to bear the weight of revelation between moments of absence. If true, it would explain why such a scroll would never survive empire. Empires thrive on declaration, not on quiet truth. And so, one luminous afternoon, as the air shimmered gold, he stepped toward the gate of the hidden horizon. His final illness had left him weak, but his gaze was steady. The accounts say he raised his hand to the sky, whispering the words, "To the highest companion," and in that moment, the veil thinned. not for him but for the world. Those who were near described a stillness so complete that the air itself seemed to listen. After his passing, the city entered a silence deeper than grief. The mosque where his voice once echoed became a chamber of breath and remembrance. The historian Ibn Sa'd wrote that the people walked as though they feared to disturb the air. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly even after dusk, a haze of light resting over the valley. The faithful took it as a sign that the gate had opened and that what entered through it would never be lost again. Centuries later, travelers wrote of this same horizon. The Andalusian geographer Al-Idrisi, who visited Medina in the 12th century, described a peculiar phenomenon, a soft radiance lingering above the western hills long after sunset. He recorded it as a light that rises from no lamp, seen only by those who have wept in remembrance. Modern scientists call it residual twilight, particles scattering sunlight beyond the curve of the earth. But the believers know better. They say it is the echo of the gate still ajar. Mystics through the ages spoke of the prophet's passage not as death, but as mirage, an ascension not upward, but inward, through the eternal horizon of mercy. For them, that gate is not a place but a rhythm, a return. It opens whenever the soul remembers where it came from. Every heart, wrote Rumi, is a horizon, and revelation still crosses it in silence. Today, when the sun sets over Medina, the sky burns with color, violet, rose, amber, then fades into a darkness so gentle that even shadows seem to pray. Pilgrims stand near his resting place, and many claim that if they close their eyes, they can feel a wind move through them, neither warm nor cold, carrying a scent of musk and dust. Some say it comes from the desert, others say it comes from beyond. Perhaps that is what the horizon truly is, not the end of the world, but the beginning of remembrance, the point where creation turns back toward its source, and the voice that once spoke in fire and whisper says again, "Come home." The night deepens, the city lights flicker. Somewhere beyond the minarets, the same stars that watched his first solitude now keep vigil above his rest. They are older than empires, softer than time. The gate remains, unseen but open, patient as mercy. And maybe, when we fall quiet enough, we can still hear it. The sound of the horizon breathing, the slow opening of the unseen. Archaeologists working in the old quarter of Kufa once uncovered a clay seal imprinted with an early Arabic script, Al-Sir Fi al-Rama. The secret lies within mercy. It bore no maker's name, only the faint trace of fire. The artifact now rests, unlabeled, in a private collection in Istanbul. Its authenticity may never be proven, yet its words hum softly like a memory too stubborn to die, where silence and light finally become the same. The desert night holds its breath. The stars seem lower now, patient and bright, as if they have drawn closer to listen. A stillness blankets the valley of Medina, the same stillness that once hovered above the cave of Hira, the garden of Tuwa, the banks of the Akik. It is the stillness of an ending that does not end. Inside a small room built of clay and palm beams, the last light burns low. The prophet lies upon a simple mat, his head resting near the lap of Aisha. The air smells of musk and rain, though no storm has passed. Outside, the city hums with quiet mourning, sandals upon dust, whispered prayers drifting through corridors of palm. Within, the prophet's breath grows softer, each inhale lighter than the last. Those who stood near said his eyes turned upward often, not in pain, but in recognition, as if he were watching words made of light, rise again toward the unseen. He had spent a lifetime receiving revelation. Now it was time to return it. The historians record his final whisper, the highest companion. Yet what they could not record was the silence that followed, vast, gentle, filled with a peace that no pen could hold. After his passing, the revelation ceased. The voice that had thundered and comforted, the voice that had woven history from breath, fell silent. But that silence was not absence. It was arrival. The words had simply gone home. It was Abu Bakr, his oldest friend, who entered first. The sun had not yet risen. He uncovered the prophet's face and kissed his forehead, saying, "You are beautiful in life and in death." Those who heard him say this would remember the tone, not the words, the sound of a man speaking to eternity through tears. The historians tell us that the Quran was gathered soon after, written upon parchment, bone, palm leaves, and the hearts of men. The fragments were carried carefully to a single volume, as if each verse were a piece of light being gathered into form. Zayd ibn Thabit, who compiled the book, later said, "When we finished, it was as though a mountain had been lifted from us." Yet even as ink replaced memory, the companions knew the real scripture was not in pages. It was in how he had lived, how he paused before speaking, how he walked gently even on gravel, how he forgave those who raised their hands against him. The Quran would preserve the words, but his life had already preserved the rhythm. Years passed and the world changed. Cities rose, empires shifted, languages spread like rivers branching through time. The book traveled farther than the caravans ever had, across mountains, seas, and centuries. Yet those who recited it in the hush before dawn felt something more than meaning. They felt return. Each verse was not a reading, but a homecoming. And so the story persists, of the scroll that vanished in firelight, leaving behind no ashes, only echoes. It is said that those who have stood near the ruins of the House of Wisdom on windless nights can still smell something faint, parchment, ink, and smoke, and hear the slow crackle of a flame that burns without heat. The Sufi mystic Rabi'a al-Adawiya once wrote, "Every word of revelation is a door. Every heart is a key." To her, revelation never ended. It continued wherever mercy was remembered. And perhaps that is the secret of why the words never died. They were written in a language that does not age, the language of breath, of surrender, of listening. In Medina, the Prophet's resting place remains beside the mosque he built with his own hands. The walls have changed, the marble gleams, but beneath it lies earth once pressed by his feet. Pilgrims who stand there often weep without knowing why. The air feels alive, as if holding the last note of a song that never finished. The scholars debate theology. The seekers simply listen. Some nights, when the lamps in the Prophet's mosque are dimmed, and only the call of the muezzin echoes softly through the arches, the city seems to exhale. The sound is low, almost like breath returning to its source. The faithful call it Ruh al-Nabi, the spirit of the Prophet. The scientists call it resonance. But all agree on one thing: the silence after the call feels like presence. Maybe that is what it means for words to return to heaven, not to vanish, but to live in the pauses between sounds. To be carried not by ink, but by the space that remains when the ink has dried. The same silence that held the first revelation now holds the last. The poets of later centuries would call him the seal of the messengers, but to the mystics, he was the mirror of completion, the one through whom the universe remembered its purpose. His story did not end with his passing. It folded back into the fabric of creation, into water, air, light, and memory. Tonight, the desert is quiet again. The same stars turn slowly over the city he once walked. The same wind moves through the same palms. Nothing has changed, and everything has. The words have returned to their source, but the echo remains. And if one listens, truly listens, beyond the sound of prayer, beyond history itself, one may still hear it. A whisper soft as dawn, saying, "Read, in the name of the one who created." Perhaps the scroll was never meant to be preserved by paper, nor discovered by scholars. Perhaps its words were meant to live where no fire can reach, in the spaces between breath and belief, in the silence that follows prayer. Some knowledge hides not to be lost, but to remain pure. The revelation continues, not as speech, but as silence that breathes. And in that silence, all creation waits, still listening. After the words returned to heaven, the world did not fall silent. It only changed its rhythm. The voice that had once spoken through revelation began to breathe through creation itself, through wind, through stars, through the pulse of the earth. What had been a message became light, and that light did not sleep. They called it Nur al-Nubuwah, the light of prophethood, not the light of the sun, not the glow of fire, but something softer, alive, unending. Historians and mystics alike wrote of it. Ibn Ishaq said that the light of the prophet had existed long before his birth, carried from Adam through generations of pure hearts until it found its form in him. Others described it as the radiance that illuminated his face even in darkness, the same radiance that once caused companions to turn away, unable to gaze too long without trembling. After his passing, that light did not vanish. It scattered, 1,000 glimmers hidden in hearts, deeds, and memories. It became the warmth in a stranger's kindness, the peace of night prayer, the small silence between two verses recited with love. Every century has seen it rise again, not in miracles, but in mercy. When the Caliph Umar rebuilt the Prophet's mosque, the masons discovered something strange. The clay near his resting place gleamed faintly in sunlight, as if it had absorbed radiance. They sealed it carefully, saying, "Let the earth keep what heaven touched." Centuries later, when the Ottomans renovated the same foundations, the workers reported a fragrance, musk and amber, rising from the soil. The records in the archives of Istanbul describe this as a scent of unknown origin. For the mystics, it was proof that the light still breathed beneath the earth. To walk through Medina is to feel that breath even now. At dawn, the sky above the Prophet's mosque glows before the sun appears, and the minarets seem to hold the color of his cloak, white woven with gold. Pilgrims who pray there speak of a hush that falls between the verses, a pause filled with a warmth that is not from lamps. Some say it is memory. Others say it is the light itself, awake, aware, remembering. In the centuries that followed, scholars, poets, and travelers all sought to describe this mystery. The Andalusian mystic Ibn al-Arabi called it the inheritance of presence, the way the Prophet's being continued to ripple through time, touching those who remembered him not by sight, but by love. Persian poets called it the lamp that sleeps in the soul. Even modern historians, studying his life with the language of reason, admit that his influence behaves like light, invisible yet shaping everything it touches. In Damascus, Cairo, Delhi, Cordoba, and Konya, that light inspired architecture and art, calligraphy flowing like revelation, domes rising like the curve of prayer, lanterns carved in patterns of infinity. But in truth, none of those creations contained it. They only mirrored it. The real light is not in stone or ink. It moves through hearts like wind through reeds, unseen, but known by its song. Tonight, as the desert stars shimmer over the old roads that once led from Mecca to Baghdad, the listener might wonder, what truth could be so gentle that even history could not bear to hold it? The flames have long faded, but the air still glows. Every believer who whispers peace be upon him keeps that light alive. It passes from breath to breath, century to century, like a flame that cannot be smothered. It is said that on the day of resurrection, that same light will gather again, not above, but within, illuminating every soul that ever remembered mercy. Science calls light a wave that travels forever unless absorbed. Faith calls it remembrance, a wave of grace that never ceases. Both truths meet in this. What was once revealed cannot be undone. In the stillness of night, when Medina sleeps and the desert hums softly beyond its edge, a pale radiance still lingers above the Prophet's resting place. The astronomers name it airglow. The faithful call it presence. Perhaps they are the same thing, the universe remembering the one who taught it to listen. For all revelation was, at its heart, an invitation to hear the silence within sound, the mercy within command, the eternity within each passing moment. And so, the light remains, not in temples or towers, but wherever compassion outshines cruelty, wherever forgiveness blooms in the shadow of pain, wherever a heart remembers what it means to bow. That is where his footsteps still move, softly, across the face of time. No empire could contain him, no century could claim him. The prophet lives not in the past but in the pulse, in every whisper of peace, in every act of patience. For as long as there are those who breathe his name with gentleness, the world will never be dark. Perhaps it was never destroyed at all. The desert, too, remembers. Each dawn, when the wind sweeps over the dunes, the grains of sand shimmer as though lit from within. Perhaps they still carry the echo of his passing. Perhaps the world itself learned to glow because of him. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the unseen place where silence and light meet, the words that once descended still rise, not as scripture, but as breath. Peace be upon him, the light that never slept. Dawn is not a moment. It is a memory. It begins long before the sun appears, in the hush between breaths, in the faint glimmer that seeps through the edge of night. In the deserts of Arabia, that glimmer still lingers, not above the dunes, but within them. The earth remembers the footsteps of the one who walked not toward glory, but toward light. When the first call to prayer echoes through Medina, it is more than sound. It is time awakening. The voice rises, soft and trembling, from the same horizon he once faced. Every Allahu Akbar carries the resonance of centuries, vibrating through the air like the heartbeat of the world. The city glows pale gold. Minarets shimmer as if woven from dust and dawn. And in that moment, everything, the stone, the air, the silence, seems to whisper the same truth. The dawn he brought has never ended. The chronicles tell us that even in his final years, the prophet would rise before the first light, standing alone in prayer while the world slept. Aisha, who watched him, said his tears fell so quietly that they blended with the sound of wind. "Do you not wish to be a thankful servant?" he once answered when she asked why he prayed so long. Gratitude, that was his dawn, the light that does not depend on the sun. After him, the dawn became inheritance. Every believer who wakes before sunrise, washing in cool water, whispering words into the still air, continues that lineage of light. The call of far became not only ritual but remembrance, the daily reawakening of a promise, that the darkness of the world cannot outlast the mercy of one heart that listens. Modern travelers who visit Medina often describe the same sensation. The sky before dawn looks alive. Astronomers explain it as scattered sunlight, an effect of upper atmosphere particles. But poets have another name for it, the breath of prophecy. For just before the call begins, the air seems to shimmer. The palms tremble. Even the shadows lean forward, as if listening. Historians writing in the Abbasid age recorded that the early Muslims called this hour as-Sa'a al-Mubaraka, the blessed time. Merchants would pause their journeys, soldiers their marches, scholars their debates. For those brief minutes before sunrise, everything became still. The mystics believed that in this stillness, the prophet's prayer still continues, a river of light flowing unseen through time. Perhaps it was merely returned, and perhaps they were right, for faith is not in relics, but in rhythm, in the daily rising of compassion from sleep. The historian Ibn Kathir once wrote that the dawn after the prophet's death was the first day the world looked the same, but was not. Yet, if one listens closely, it is clear he did not vanish. He became the rhythm of morning itself. Centuries pass, empires fall, languages change. Yet the dawn sounds the same. In Cairo, in Cordoba, in Istanbul, in Karachi, the same cadence, the same ascent of breath into the unseen. The faithful rise, as he did, whispering the same invocation. And as their voices join, the world glows, invisible threads connecting every horizon where dawn remembers him. The 13th century poet Yunus Emre wrote, "He lit the lamp and went, the flame remains." Rumi called him the dawn that never sleeps. To the mystics, he is not history. He is recurrence, the pulse that reminds the world of its source. Every dawn is his reflection, reborn across the face of time. Even the earth testifies. In Medina, the soil around his resting place remains warmer than the air in winter. Geologists note this as a thermal anomaly. The mystics call it Nur al-Baka, the warmth of eternity. It is said that when the first rays of morning touch that ground, the fragrance of musk and rose briefly fills the air. Scientists might dismiss it as coincidence. The believers simply smile. He is awake. The dawn he brought was not the end of night. It was its purpose. For even darkness exists to cradle light. The dunes stretch endlessly toward the horizon, their ridges glimmering like sleeping waves under the pale breath of dawn. A silence hums across the desert, vast, eternal, patient. Somewhere within that stillness once moved a solitary traveler. He was neither merchant nor messenger in those days, only a seeker following paths the maps had forgotten. Between Mecca and the northern frontiers, beyond the marked caravan routes, he walked, guided not by compass or coin, but by something quieter. Each time the sun rises, it passes over Mecca and Medina before reaching the rest of the world, as if retracing the path of revelation. The call begins there, travels across seas, valleys, continents, wave after wave of far prayer unfolding like petals opening toward eternity. It never stops. When one land finishes, another begins. There has never been a moment since that first dawn when the earth was without remembrance. The world breathes in prayer without pause, a single heartbeat shared by billions. That is the true miracle. Not the heavens splitting, but humanity remembering, endlessly, tenderly, through light. And when we close our eyes at night, listening to the soft echo of that call, it carries us too, into that timeless dawn where he still stands, hands raised, eyes open to the first light, whispering gratitude for a mercy that never sleeps. There is a silence older than history, not the silence of absence, but of presence too vast for words. It lingers where revelation once breathed, where sand still holds the shape of footsteps that never faded. The desert sleeps beneath the moon, but the moon remembers. Every star that flickers above Medina, above Mecca, above every soul that ever whispered his name, shines because of that remembrance. The wind that moves between the palms carries no sound, yet it is full of voice. The journey that began with a whisper in a cave ends not with death, but with return. For revelation was never a moment. It was a rhythm, the heart of creation remembering its own origin. Now, as night folds the world again in softness, the echoes of all 11 chapters blend into one. The mountain that waited, the river that remembered, the dream that taught the moon to listen, the dawn that never ended. Long before revelation became scripture, the trade routes of Arabia were the veins of the ancient world. From Yemen's incense valleys to the ports of Gaza and Damascus, caravans carried silk, myrrh, salt, and gold. The Prophet once joined such journeys in his youth, leading the caravans of Khadijah northward toward Basra, through Wadi al-Qura, and across the basalt plains of Al-Hira. Modern archaeologists still find remnants of those paths. Stone waypoints carved with Nabatean letters, fragments of caravanserais buried beneath sand. They tell of a time when merchants followed the stars, and silence was the only guide through the sea of dunes. All are one breath, rising, falling, resting in the same mercy. Some say prophecy ended. Others know it only changed its language. It speaks now through silence, through kindness, through every small act that turns darkness into light. And so, when the last light dims and the listener drifts toward sleep, this story does not close. It continues inward, in the place where memory becomes prayer. The prophet once said that sleep is the brother of death, but he also said that every awakening is a resurrection. So perhaps this story, told beneath the breath of stars, is neither ending nor beginning, but the quiet in between, the silence that still speaks, the light that still listens, the dawn that never ends. It was along these same ancient roads that the prophet later wandered, no longer for trade, but for thought. Between the basalt hills of Hijaz and the oasis towns of Tema and Dumat al-Jandal, he would pause where others hurried. Bedouin oral traditions speak of a quiet man who sat at dusk near abandoned wells, tracing circles in the dust, watching the shadows lengthen. In their retellings, he spoke little, but his eyes reflected the horizon as though he were seeing beyond it. Archaeological surveys conducted in these regions reveal the foundations of way stations once used by Quraysh traders. The remains of clay hearths, shards of Yemeni amphory, and faint soot marks on the limestone walls, all evidence of journeys that connected worlds. But beneath these visible traces lies something else, the path of silence that no excavation can uncover, the road of inner migration. In the solitude of those wanderings, the desert itself became a teacher. The dunes shifted like thoughts. The stars drew maps not of places but of meaning. The traveler learned to listen to what had no sound, the pulse of wind through canyon stones, the quiet rhythm of his own heart beneath the weight of infinity. To the historians, these were the unrecorded years. But to the mystics, they were the years when revelation learned the language of patience. Once, near the ruins of Khaybar, explorers uncovered an inscription. Simple, incomplete. He passed this way, and the night was gentle. The script dates from the 6th or early 7th century, etched by an anonymous hand. No one can say whose passage it marked. Yet reading it under a flickering lamp, one cannot help but imagine that same still traveler resting under a sky thick with stars, whispering verses not yet written. The desert does not forget. Beneath its shifting face, it guards the footprints of prophets and shepherds alike. Even now, satellite images reveal faint traces of caravan roads running like veins through the sand, some leading nowhere, dissolving mid-desert as if the earth itself swallowed them. Geographers call them routes of interruption. Sufis call them the paths of testing, roads that end so the soul might begin. On nights when the moon rose full above the Hijaz Mountains, the traveler would stop and watch its ascent. The sand turned silver, the air still as prayer. He would speak no words, yet within that silence, meaning bloomed. Later chroniclers described how revelation came to him like the sound of a bell, and how its weight pressed upon his chest like stone. But before the bell, there was the hush, the long quiet walk where the soul learned to hear what was already written in light. Near Dumat al-Jandal, one of Arabia's northernmost oases, archaeologists found remnants of a pre-Islamic sanctuary aligned precisely with the rising of Sirius, the star of travelers. In the same region, local lore speaks of a night long ago when a single traveler stood before the sanctuary and prayed, though none could hear his words. They say the wind fell still, and even the camels refused to move. Then, before dawn, he vanished. Perhaps that story is only desert memory, retold by generations who knew the weight of silence. Yet within such tales lies a truth deeper than fact, that every journey worth taking begins not with movement, but with stillness. The years beyond the caravan routes were not lost. They were the map's invisible ink. They were the shaping of a message in the quiet spaces between destinations. When he returned to Mecca, the city saw only a familiar figure, calm, reflective, unchanged. But the desert had already rewritten him. His eyes held distances no one could name. His words would later hold worlds. Now, centuries later, travelers who cross the Hijaz by train or highway look out their windows and see the same emptiness. Sand, rock, horizon. Yet beneath it lies the same invisible road. And if one listens closely, beyond the hum of engines, there is still a whisper, soft, eternal, like the echo of a man walking between revelation and remembrance, leaving behind not footprints, but silence. Perhaps he never left the desert at all. Perhaps the desert simply learned to speak through him. There are gardens in Arabia that no longer exist, yet the wind remembers their fragrance. Somewhere between the ridges of Mecca and the silent valleys beyond Jabal Thor, there once grew a cluster of palms and myrtle trees, a green breath in a land of stone. In the hush before revelation, he would come there at twilight, when the sun melted into copper behind the western hills. He came not to speak, but to listen. The garden waited. The air shimmered with the scent of earth cooling after heat. Insects hummed like distant prayers. It was here, say the traces of memory, that the first secret was heard, not as a voice, but as stillness recognizing itself. Early chroniclers mention that before the command to recite descended in the cave of Hira, the prophet often retreated to places of solitude near Mecca, gardens tended by friends or quiet enclaves near the springs of Tuwa and Arafat. These were small, private sanctuaries, not palaces of greenery, but humble patches of shade where palms bent gently toward pools of clear water. Archaeologists have found ancient irrigation channels beneath the Meccan Valley, stone conduits carved by early tribes, proof that such gardens once thrived. Their remains, buried beneath centuries of dust, whisper that faith often begins where water meets patience. In that half-forgotten oasis, time moved differently. Each leaf trembled as though listening. Each droplet of water reflected the dimming sky like a mirror of unseen truths. He would sit upon a worn stone, his cloak folded beneath him, watching the colors fade into night. To those who later wrote his biography, this was simply meditation. But the mystics who came after saw more. They called it the listening of the soul. Some accounts from the Meccan elders, preserved in fragments of oral tradition, describe him resting by the garden's edge, his gaze upon the horizon where the dunes turned violet in evening light. They say a bird landed near him, a desert thrush, and sang 3 notes before falling silent. He smiled and whispered something no one heard. When the bird flew away, he closed his eyes, and for a long while, the garden itself seemed to hold its breath. Modern historians studying the early spiritual life of Arabia point to the gardens near Wadi Fatima, a region once rich with wells and small farms even in the 6th century. Excavations there reveal traces of circular stone platforms, perhaps seating, perhaps ritual spaces. To believers, such findings do not prove faith. They illustrate it. They remind us that the path to revelation was not forged only in caves or battles, but in quiet corners of life, where creation itself leaned closer to listen. In the garden, sound was slow, a drop of water falling, a leaf brushing another, the faint movement of air through reeds. The prophet's thoughts drifted with these small rhythms. Between heaven's silence and earth's stillness, he found a gate neither open nor closed. It was there that reflection became communion. When he later spoke of signs upon the horizon and within the soul, perhaps he remembered this. The palm's shadow across the pool, the hush between breath and breeze, the heart's secret reply to creation's whisper. Sufi scholars centuries later would call such moments the first gardens of knowledge. They believed revelation was not sudden, but ripened, like fruit in shadow before dawn. A few of them even described visions of this garden. Light moving through leaves as if the stars themselves descended to rest among the branches. Whether dream or memory, the image persisted. A green heart within the desert, where the divine spoke not in thunder, but in warmth. Today, no trace of that small garden remains. The floods that reshaped Mecca's valleys, the rise of stone and road, the long passage of empires, all have hidden it. But when modern pilgrims walk through the narrow lanes near Mount Thor, they still pass small patches of unexpected green. Slender palms rising from courtyards, tiny springs that never dry. And in the evenings, when the call to prayer drifts through the air, something of that ancient stillness returns. The garden may be gone, but its silence continues, in the way the heart quiets before prayer, in the hush that follows the final word of remembrance. Perhaps that was its secret all along. That divine truth does not thunder into the world. It grows quietly, like shade and heat. The last light fades. The garden folds into night. The pools catch the stars like silver coins. Somewhere among them, a breeze passes, gentle, almost imperceptible, and for an instant, It feels as though time itself listens again. Perhaps the first secret was never spoken. Perhaps it was simply the sound of a soul hearing itself for the first time. The shore lies quiet beneath the pale shimmer of dawn. The Red Sea breathes in slow, steady tides, ancient as the world itself. Its waves roll like whispers against the land, smoothing the edges of forgotten footprints. Somewhere along these coasts, between Yanbu and the stony reaches of Alcanfuta, the traveler once walked alone. He paused where sea and desert met, and with a fingertip traced words into the wet sand, not for others to read, but for the sea to carry. The letters were simple, transient, dissolving as each wave returned. He wrote not to preserve, but to release, words meant for silence, not permanence. To those who later followed him, these gestures would become the symbol of surrender, to write upon what cannot hold, to speak to that which cannot answer, trusting that the unseen would understand. Modern archaeologists studying the western coasts of Arabia have found small waypoints and ruins of early settlements, fishing villages that existed even in the 6th century, where trade ships from Aksum and the Horn of Africa once anchored. Among the coral cliffs near Yanbu, inscriptions in early Arabic have been discovered. Names, prayers, fragments of poetry carved by travelers who waited for wind or tide. One of them reads, "To write upon water is to trust eternity." The sentiment feels impossibly modern, yet it belongs to the same silence that once guided the prophet in his solitude. He would have known these shores. Trade caravans from Mecca to the north often followed the coast before turning inland toward Syria. Perhaps, on one of his solitary retreats, he came to the edge of the sea at dusk, where salt met sand and the horizon blurred into gold. The Quraysh at that time called this region Bar al-Ahmar, the Red Sea, though the name came not from color, but from the ancient Himyarite word for the deep. The Himyar themselves, builders of Yemen's stone temples and masters of incense routes, had long vanished by then. But the air still carried their memory, of travelers who once looked upon the same water and wondered where it ended. He crouched low, his reflection rippling in the tide. With slow movements he drew lines, curves, the shapes of thought before speech. Some say he was practicing letters. Others imagine he was tracing the rhythm of prayer. But perhaps he was simply writing silence itself, letting the sea erase it, letting the erasure become the message. For what is faith, if not the courage to offer meaning to the wind? Centuries later, mystics and poets would recall this act in metaphor. Jalal al-Din Rumi wrote, "The ink of the heart writes only upon water." Ibn Arabi called it the script of surrender. To them it was a sacred gesture, an acknowledgement that divine truth is written not to be kept, but to be felt. On these same coasts, archaeologists have found fragments of glass beads, pottery from Egypt, and obsidian tools once traded across the sea. The sands hold layers of history, Nabatean, Roman, Abyssinian, each tide burying and revealing. And yet, none of these remains explain the human need to inscribe meaning upon the impermanent. Perhaps that is why the sea continues to feel holy in this region. The Quran later speaks of two waters meeting but not mixing, salt and fresh, an image drawn from this very geography, where inland springs meet the Red Sea's vastness. The prophet's contemplation of these places likely shaped his understanding of divine boundaries, how closeness and separation can coexist, how one thing may touch another without being lost. As dusk fell, he might have stood and watched his words dissolve under the returning tide. Each erased line shimmered briefly, then vanished, as if the sea itself had read them. Behind him, the desert waited, vast, unending, expectant. The first stars appeared, trembling in the horizon's silver haze. Perhaps he whispered a prayer, perhaps he said nothing at all. In that quiet exchange between hand and sea, something passed. A message without sound, a vow without witnesses. The place where he stood is lost to maps now. Modern ports have replaced the silence. Ships hum through the night, and the shoreline has shifted. But the gesture remains eternal. Even now, when travelers walk the Red Sea coast at twilight, they sometimes kneel and draw shapes into the sand without knowing why. The tide still rises, still erases, still carries away what was written. Maybe all revelation begins this way, as letters written where no one can keep them. Maybe the sea remembers what we were never meant to know. Long before the light, there was the mountain. Long before the word was spoken, before the ink of revelation met the page of history, it waited silent, vast, black against the desert sky. The Bedouin of the Hijaz called it Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light, though in those early days before the night of destiny it was a mountain of darkness, not because it lacked illumination but because it held too much of it hidden within. At dusk, its shape rose from the valley like a sleeping sentinel. The stones shimmered faintly under the last fire of the sun, then folded into shadow. From its flanks, Mecca appeared as a scattering of small fires, hearths of merchants, flickering in the wind. Beyond, the dunes unrolled endlessly toward Yemen in one direction, toward the Red Sea in another. But within the mountain's hollow heart was a cave, barely large enough for a man to kneel. It was here, the chroniclers say, that the prophet would climb, alone, often, and without words, long before the first revelation descended. Even now, the ascent to the cave of Hira is steep and silent. Modern pilgrims climb it in daylight, clutching bottles of water, whispering prayers into the wind. But in those early years, he climbed it under stars, barefoot, carrying nothing. The path was a ribbon of broken rock, the air thin, the silence absolute. Scholars from the Islamic Research Institute who studied the terrain describe it as a geography of isolation. The mountains angle steep enough to turn the climb into devotion. They measured the distance, 2 miles northeast of the Kaaba, elevation 642 meters, visibility clear to the horizon. From the summit, one could see not the world, but its stillness. It was there he would sit for hours, sometimes for days. No light but the moon. No sound but his breath and the slow, eternal murmur of the wind that curved around the rock. Later biographers record that he carried food for weeks, often brought by Khadija, his wife and confidant. Yet the sustenance that mattered was not the bread or water, but the quiet. In that solitude, each heartbeat became an ocean, each silence a question. Historians note that the region's caves were once used by hermits and ascetics, Christian monks, Zoroastrian wanderers, and the Hanifs, the pre-Islamic monotheists who sought God beyond idols. Archaeologists exploring the nearby mountains have found ancient inscriptions invoking Ramanan, the most merciful, a divine name shared across faiths long before Islam was proclaimed. The mountain, then, was already sacred to seekers, yet it was waiting for a silence pure enough to answer back. On certain nights, the wind carried the fragrance of the valley below, roasted grain, burning resin, distant human life, and still he remained unmoving. The mountain became his cathedral, the stars its roof, and the sand its endless congregation. He watched the constellations shift slowly, Orion rising, the moon slipping behind the ridge, the Milky Way stretching like a silver river across the sky. Perhaps he thought of Abraham, who once looked at the same stars and saw in their light a single truth. Perhaps he thought of nothing at all. And then, there were the nights when fear crept in, not of beasts or cold, but of the immensity of silence. The kind of silence that listens back. The kind that weighs upon the soul like a question without words. It is said that revelation came with the sound of a bell, but before the bell came the pressure, the gravity of divine presence gathering in darkness. Some mystics later wrote that even mountains feel the nearness of heaven, and tremble beneath it. If so, Jabal al-Nur trembled gently in those years, knowing what was to come. The 7th century geographer al-Azraqi described Hira as a mountain clothed in shadow and light, the dwelling of solitude. Later, when the Quran would speak of creation trembling at the weight of divine trust, we offered the trust to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they refused, but man accepted it. Some said it was this mountain that first bowed its head and waited. In one surviving manuscript from the 10th century, written by the scholar Ibn Ishaq al-Faisai, there appears an account of travelers who climbed Hira centuries after the prophet's death. They claimed that at the summit, their lamps would flicker without wind, their voices would soften without reason. It is as if the air remembers, one wrote, as if the silence here still holds its breath, and perhaps it does, For history is heavy with places that remember more than people. The stones of Hira remain unchanged, black basalt, coarse and unyielding. But within them lives the echo of that first solitude. The prophet's heartbeat, steady against the rock. The first stirrings of thought, the trembling before the infinite. When at last revelation came, the command to recite, the mountain must have known. The silence that had stretched for centuries finally broke. Yet what replaced it was not noise, but light. The wind that carried the word down to Mecca that night was the same wind that once circled those stones, waiting. Modern climbers describe the dawn from Hira as unreal, the way the sun ignites the valley like gold dust scattered across stone. One of them, a geologist, once wrote, "It feels less like sunrise, more like remembrance, and perhaps that is what the mountain offers, not history but memory, not proof but presence." When the prophet descended that final time, trembling, covered in awe, the mountain did not move. It watched him vanish into the folds of night, watched the valley begin to awaken, watched the first light return to the world. Since then, it has waited in silence again, century after century, as pilgrims and scholars climb its spine to feel the same darkness, not to find revelation, but to stand where silence once became word. The mountain remains older than memory, patient as stone. It does not speak. It does not forget. Perhaps, even now, it waits still, holding the shadow of the moment when heaven touched the earth. The years of silence did not belong to one man alone. Around him moved others, quiet souls who never sought the gaze of history. Their names were not etched into marble or sung from pulpits, yet without them, the road itself might have faded. They were the companions of the hidden path, those who walked beside him not as witnesses of revelation, but as keepers of its stillness. The chronicles speak often of wars, treaties, and proclamations, but rarely of these earlier companions. The shepherd who offered shade on the climb to Hira, the craftsman who mended his sandals, the woman who left dates and milk near the mountain trail without ever asking why. These lives, small and unrecorded, became the quiet threads that held the tapestry of destiny together. One of the earliest sources, Sirat ibn Ishaq, mentions unnamed helpers who brought provisions during the prophet's long retreats. Archaeologists studying early Meccan routes have traced narrow footpaths that once led toward Jabal al-Nur, paths too steep for caravans, but perfect for those who traveled alone or in pairs, carrying small baskets, soft-footed under starlight. A few ancient stone markers still stand along those trails, half buried in dust, engraved with barely visible symbols. A palm, a crescent, a hand. To scholars, they are waypoints. To mystics, they are signs left by those who loved in silence. These companions lived ordinary lives. They tilled soil, sold cloth, fetched water from wells that no longer exist. Yet something in them recognized the weight of his solitude. When he withdrew from the noise of the city, they understood, not with reason, but with reverence, that silence itself had become a form of worship. They did not follow him into the cave, but they guarded its base, protecting the stillness above. One was an old Bedouin named Harith, who tended goats near the eastern ridges. He once told a traveler, long before his words were forgotten, that he had seen a light upon the mountain not like fire, not like the moon, but like the air remembering its own glow. Whether this tale was true or shaped by legend no one can say, yet the tone of it remains. Awe without claim, faith without need. Centuries later, during excavations near the Valley of Tuwa, researchers uncovered fragments of pottery marked with primitive Arabic letters. One shard bore a single phrase. He prays for the one who listens. It could have belonged to anyone, yet those who study the early Hijaz believe it was part of a vessel left as offering. A gesture from someone who wished to feed the man who climbed, even if unseen. The shard now rests in the National Museum in Riyadh, cracked but legible. The ink is brown, faded, and fragile, but the hand that wrote it trembled with intention. In those years, before Mecca became a place of pilgrimage, the faithful were few and uncounted. Some came and went without knowing what they sought. Others stayed at the edges, women who whispered verses they did not yet understand, children who followed his shadow at dawn. Among them was a youth named Zayd, later remembered as the adopted son of the prophet. Long before faith found a name, Zayd followed him into the hills, bringing water, watching from a distance as the solitary figure bowed toward the horizon. In later years, he would say only this: "I saw a man listening to what the desert was saying." The companions of the hidden path were not scholars or saints. They were echoes of humanity's quiet side, the side that kneels before mystery and asks for nothing in return. The historians did not write their stories, but their presence lingers between the lines of what survived. Every act of unseen kindness, every gesture that kept solitude safe, was their scripture. Even today, in the dry wadis surrounding Mecca, there are stories told by old families, of ancestors who climbed the lower slopes of Jabal al-Nur carrying food, never knowing they were part of something eternal. When the prophet later spoke of faith being light, they must have remembered the lamps they carried up that mountain, their small flames trembling against the desert wind. Mystics have always believed that revelation never arrives to one heart alone. It ripples outward through those who stand nearby, through the soil, through the stones. Perhaps those who helped him in silence received that echo. Perhaps they too felt the invisible tremor when heaven drew near. In the archives of Cairo, there exists a parchment fragment dated to the early Abbasid period. It contains a poem attributed to an anonymous Zahid, an ascetic who claimed descent from those who brought the prophet water. The poem begins, "We carried no light, yet our hands were warmed." It ends, "He walked alone, but we were not alone." Whether fact or legend, it captures what the historians could not: the holiness of being near. As centuries turned, their memory dissolved into myth. But sometimes, silence remembers what speech forgets. When the pilgrims today climb the mountain trail, they pass places where the wind changes pitch, where the stones seem to hum faintly. The guides call them echo points, geological quirks, they say, that carry sound across the valley. Yet many pause there anyway, whispering prayers into the dark, sensing the faint presence of footsteps long gone. In the greater story of Revelation, these companions will never be named. Yet perhaps that is the secret of their sanctity. Theirs was the religion of the unnoticed, of those who light the lamp but do not claim the flame, who prepare the way but never walk upon it. The prophet's mission would one day shake empires, but it was built first upon the quiet loyalty of those who asked for nothing. When night falls upon Mecca and the mountain once more darkens against the stars, it is said that the air carries two kinds of silence, one heavy with mystery and another soft with memory. The first belongs to revelation, the second to those who carried it without knowing. Maybe that is what sainthood truly means, to guard the unseen and to disappear inside it. And maybe, if you listen closely enough beneath the desert wind, you can still hear them, not speaking, not praying, just breathing beside the mountain, waiting, as they always did, for the light to rise again. The city sleeps beneath layers of dust and prayer. Once, its walls gleamed white under the Arabian sun. Now they crumble in silence, half buried, half remembered. Wind drifts through its empty courtyards, and the call of distant bells, perhaps from a goat, perhaps from memory, trembles in the heat. No traveler today would know that a prophet once passed here, his sandals tracing lines through its narrow streets, his voice soft against the hum of trade. Historians believe this forgotten place was once called Tema, an oasis city on the old incense route, halfway between Mecca and the Levant. The ruins still stand, fragments of walls, faint carvings of palms and stars, the remains of an altar where Nabatean merchants once offered dates and myrrh to nameless gods. Inscriptions found there, now kept in the Riyadh Museum, bear words of ancient longing: peace upon the traveler, whoever he is. Archaeologists say these stones date to the 6th century. The faithful whisper something else. That one night, the traveler was not just any man.